Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone in-house to make sure your cell phones have been turned off as a courtesy to our guest. And, of course, we will post the program on our website within 24 hours for everyone's future reference. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion this afternoon is Dr. Niall Gardner, Director of our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He's a leading authority on transatlantic relations. His key specialization areas include the U.S. Anglo-Special Relationship, the United Nations, post-war Iraq, and the role of Great Britain and Europe in the U.S.-led alliance against international terrorism. Prior to joining us, Dr. Gardner was foreign policy researcher for former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and advised her on a number of international policy issues as well. While working in her private office, he also assisted Lady Thatcher with her book, Statecraft: Strategies for a Changing World. Please join me in welcoming Niall Gardner. Niall?
Thank you very much, John. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. Our hearts and prayers go out to the victims of this morning's Navy Yard shooting, as well as to their families. I'm honoured to introduce a long-standing friend of Heritage, the Right Honourable Iain Duncan Smith, MP, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions in the United Kingdom. We have been privileged to host Iain here in Washington on several occasions over the past 2 decades, and we are grateful to have him return today to the United States in his role as a key cabinet minister in the British government. Iain was elected to the House of Commons in 1992 and went on to lead the Conservative Party from 2001 to 2003. Iain established the Centre for Social Justice in London in 2004, an independent think tank committed to tackling poverty and social breakdown, and was subsequently appointed to the Cabinet in 2010 by Prime Minister David Cameron. As Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Iain Duncan Smith has introduced the most radical reforms to Britain's welfare system since it was created, moving away from maintaining people on inactive benefits, instigating wide-scale disability benefit reform, and finally making work pay. In his speech today, Iain will consider how Conservatives on both sides of the Atlantic can bring enduring values to bear on our most pressing social problems in order to tackle poverty, disadvantage, and dependency. He will explain how transforming Britain's welfare system goes hand in hand with transforming people's life chances, continuing a historic mission that Conservatives, including William Wilberforce, Lord Shaftesbury, and Abraham Lincoln, have always had to help people improve the quality of their lives. These are issues we care deeply about here at the Heritage Foundation, which has played a lead role in welfare reform efforts in the United States. We share many of the same goals and principles Iain is fighting for in Great Britain, not least a firm belief that work and family must be at the very heart of a successful and prosperous society. Iain Duncan Smith is a man of tremendous principle, a Conservative in the tradition of Margaret Thatcher, who cares passionately about his country, the defence of individual liberty, and the future of the Anglo-American special relationship. Iain is a conviction politician offering clear-cut Conservative solutions to major problems, emphasising individual responsibility, a strong work ethic, and traditional values. We are delighted and honoured to have Iain back at Heritage to talk to us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you again for kindly offering me the opportunity to come and address you. I'd also like to thank Jim Dindemint, who came over and we talked about this possibility some months ago, so my thanks to both of you. Also, my thanks to Heritage generally, really, for 2 things. One, for the work that you carry out as an organisation tirelessly to ensure that what I consider to be an authentic Conservative voice often sounds out here in the United States in amidst the competing and alternative arguments. And secondly, that the way in which this organisation works incredibly hard for the ties, the historic and strong ties between our 2 old and enduring parties that share so much together. And we forget that these two ties are really, really important and stand at the crossroads of the debate around freedom. It's these two parties, the Republican and the Conservatives, invariably, that have been at the heart of that. So I thank you for that continuing support for us. I also want to say it's a real pleasure to be here before I get into speech in a place where I hope you can all understand pretty much every word that I say, despite the nuances. But I was, if I reflect on a small difference, going to Berlin the other day where we attended a conference of a number of different nationalities, and I'd waited so long to speak. By the time I actually finally spoke, I did say that in that classic, rather British, self-deprecating way, that I'd waited so long that just like the rest of them, I'd probably lost the will to live. But I would make every opportunity to make my comments. Sadly, as I discovered later on, there was complete silence in the room. It didn't go down at all well. And I discovered later on that that it had been translated as, sadly, I am terminally ill, which brought me a lot of sympathy from Chancellor Merkel, who looked rather nicely at me, actually, for a period, and sadly. So the only person who understood it really was the Irish Taoiseach, who was roaring with laughter in the corner, but he got a reputation for being rather callous at that point, and I haven't been able to rescue him from that. So my thanks again for allowing me to come and speak to you. Really, in 2004, I set up an organisation which I named the Centre for Social Justice, a sort of challenging name for Conservatives in some sense. And at that time, the Conservatives were going through a pretty difficult time in the UK. For some of you may recall, Tony Blair was leader of the Labour Party, was riding high, having won 2 elections with staggering majorities and sweeping really all before him. It was impossible, it seemed, either on the media or anywhere, to get a voice of Conservative critique that wasn't dismissed almost immediately. Conservatism was then in despair, and there therefore was an angry debate about whose fault it was that raged within its ranks to such an extent that it was really quite difficult for a period to get the party to focus on regaining government. It was a really factional debate. And second, if they weren't arguing with each other, it seemed to me, looking at my party, they used to spend the rest of their time blaming the electorate, in a sense, for allowing themselves to be duped by what they referred to as the arch charlatan, Tony Blair. So there was a very difficult period as Conservatives at that point. An argument even raged between what we then described as the self-styled mods and rockers. I need to explain that. This goes back to a period in the 1950s when youth were divided into those who rode Vespers and dressed in nice, smart, natty clothes, and those who rode motorcycles and dressed in leather jackets. And they used to fight on the beaches of Brighton and places like that back in the late 50s and 60s. But therefore, they were termed in the Conservative Party mods and rockers. And it really is the modernisers, or what they call the traditionalists. And hardly a day went by but that a new theory was announced by one or more of these particular groups of Conservatives. Some said we should accept that too few in the electorate and the public at large wanted conservatism and Conservatives anymore, and that we should kind of destroy or burn the party and reform a new modern party from the ashes of what had existed. On the other side, the solution was alternatively to return to the halcyon days of Thatcher and sharpen and increase our critique of Blair, and all would be well. This process of communication, I think, was stolen from that age-old English speaker's solution when arriving in foreign lands and dealing in foreign languages. When confronted by someone who doesn't really speak English or appear to understand you, you speak slower and you speak louder, because that always solves the problem. So dogged was this argument that I used to reflect rather ruefully and observe that most Conservatives could pick a fight in an empty room. My problem wasn't the fight. It was that, sadly, it seemed to me that the empty room invariably won. This was a problem for us. So if I might be so bold, as an observer and I think a friend of the Republican Party, looking at it, there also seems occasionally a risk of something similar going on here. So I hope I'm able to observe some of these things as a way to help. Conservatism on both sides of the Atlantic has survived because it's not based on ideology, but on unchanging values. This has always allowed the Conservatives to accept change where necessary, shaped, however, by the unchanging values which underpin our politics: strong families creating strong communities, grounded by personal freedom, whose boundaries are governed by democratic consent and arbitrated always by the rule of law. A contemporary philosopher, Roger Scruton, wrote, and I want to quote this because I think it's quite important, "Political wisdom," he said, Burke argued, "is not contained in a single head. It does not reside in the plans and schemes of the political class, and can never be reduced to a system. It resides in the social organism as a whole, in the myriad small compromises, in the local negotiations and trusts through which people adjust to the presence of their neighbours and cooperate in safeguarding what they share. People must be free to associate, to form little platoons, to dispose of their labour, their property, and their affections according to their own desires and needs. And it is though these perennial values, it's through them that we weigh and assess the need to preserve that which is good and that which must ultimately change. For as Burke has also said, we must all obey the great law of change. It is the most powerful law of nature. The question, therefore, is not just what and whether, but when and how such change must take place. For too long, Conservatives had allowed themselves, I think, to be defined by a narrow number of policy areas, taxation, immigration, and law and order. This meant that we looked back at past triumphs and gave previous leaders almost mythical status. Margaret Thatcher's reforms of the trade unions, the liberalising of the economy, and tax reduction became for many the definition of what it meant to be a Conservative. So instead of applying our values to new challenges, we were to be defined by challenges of the past. Yet any analysis of what Thatcher's government achieved would show that it was not locked to the past themselves, but dealt with the pressing challenges of the time by applying those perennial values. Let me illustrate that point. In 1979, Britain was in economic decline. The unions had become far too strong, and abroad the Soviet Union threatened our very liberty. Meeting these enormous challenges and defeating them were the key priorities of that time. And to do that, Thatcher knew that she needed to free the people from the grip of socialism, break down government control, and give back to the people the freedom to choose their own money to make those choices. Well, so it was for President Reagan. Together, these two leaders met the challenges by applying conservative values with iron resolve and courage, yes, but importantly, they retained and expounded their optimism for their country and their fellow citizens, whatever their station in life. The two lessons to learn from these two iconic leaders are that you don't meet the challenges of being too narrow by trying to become something you are not. No, you need to challenge and meet that of being too narrow by showing that your values cover a wider and broader agenda. And the second and no less important lesson, that is, to those who use Thatcher and Reagan to lay claim to the idea that politics must be absolutely ideologically pure, again, I think, misrepresent who they were. Focus and clarity are absolutely, of course, vital. But in delivering such an agenda, they taught us that pragmatism is also important as well. Some battles may have to feature lower on the list of priorities. Conservative pragmatism is more often about evolution rather than a revolution. How ironic, then, that despite these important lessons, so often when one listens to Conservatives on the radio and television today, they sound ideological when they are not, whilst the left sounds reasonable when in reality it's much more ideological. All this brings me back to the Centre for Social Justice and why then I set it up. I have believed for some time that we cannot have a modern flexible economy if so many of the people who service that economy are locked into a form of dependency on the state, unable or unwilling to work. When I came into government, nearly a quarter of the working age population was economically inactive in the UK. Such growing dependency would, I believe, not only go on to cost taxpayer huge sums of money, but worse, perhaps render these people dependent on state handouts and trap their families in such dependency, incapable of escaping the net for generations to come. This, in turn, has helped to create a demand for foreign workers to fill the jobs that British people could be doing themselves. In visit after visit to some of our more deprived areas of Britain, I came to see how they had become places without hope or opportunity. In one area, the male life expectancy was 54, yet some few miles away, in the same city, life expectancy was over 80. These living in those deprived areas had one thing in common. They were for the most part dependent on the state for their daily needs. Families where no one had ever worked, drug and alcohol abuse prevalent, high crime, and high numbers of families where the fathers were absent. In a modern nation like Britain, I felt it could not be right that such pockets of deprivation should continue to exist. At the root of this problem was that Conservatives have abandoned the subject of poverty to the poverty lobby and the liberal left. Perhaps our main contribution to the subject was that whenever Conservative politicians did speak about poverty, they more often did so with fingers wagging and harsh and punitive language. My party, the party of Wilberforce and Shaftesbury, and as Niall said here, the party of Lincoln, seemed to have forgotten that we had always had a historic mission to help people improve the quality of their lives, not just sustain them in dependency whilst taking the easy option of attacking them. So I set up the Centre for Social Justice to challenge the accepted wisdom of the left that poverty is only about money and that more state money would somehow cure it. The CSJ was to show that whilst money, of course, plays a part in the debate, other, perhaps more important factors were in play. We needed to understand better how someone had reached the point where they were unable to earn the money necessary to break free from poverty. That is where we defined the 5 pathways to poverty: debt, family breakdown, addiction, failed education, and worklessness and dependency. Instead of treating the symptoms, it was time to treat the cause. But the CSJ was also to do something else. It was to show that Conservatives cared about people trapped in dependency, that far from wanting to punish people, we were on a mission to save them, to put hope back where it had gone, and to ally aspiration alongside hard work. The irony was that Conservatives had also forgotten that historic mission to care for the working poor. Those who remember in this room, and I hope abroad, that great Australian Conservative leader, often too unstated, John Howard, he used to refer to this group as the battlers, whose life is hard and who see too easily how dependency net has become an entrapment for far too many. So first we had to show what the true state of the nation was in social deprivation, to define the debate about poverty in terms of its causes. To do this, we created 2 vitally important publications. The first, Breakdown Britain. This catalogued the extent of debt, family breakdown, failed education, addiction, and dependency. And what we uncovered graphically was a nation blighted by multiple and overlapping social problems, often perpetuated over generations. We found Britain had the highest divorce rates in the Western world, with family breakdown costing the UK government the equivalent of some $30 billion a year. More than 1 in 10 children were growing up without a resident biological father. Over 1.25 million children with alcohol or drug-addicted parents. From these dysfunctional homes, we found that children from disadvantaged backgrounds were then 5 times more likely to fail academically compared to their peers. 1 in 10 children were failing to achieve the most basic standards of English and maths at age 16, leaving school only to become part of a growing underclass. More than 4 million economically inactive adults trapped without work, the same 7 million people found to have suffered bad debt, struggling to escape poverty, but heading straight back into the clutches of doorstep and payday lenders. The scale of the problem we faced was clear. Our second publication, Breakthrough Britain, was about developing the solutions, conservative solutions. Even in the most desolate and deprived corners of the country, small charities and community groups were growing and proving that poverty could be defeated. By learning from these organizations, Breakthrough Britain offered lasting solutions to change the lives of those most affected. And I stress to change the lives of those most affected, to help them become self-reliant and responsible citizens. It was Burke, again, who predicted what would happen if such collapse in self-reliance went unchecked. He said, and I quote, Society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon will and appetite be placed somewhere, and the less of it within, the more then there must be without. So true. Break down Britain and break through Britain, I believe, changed the terms of the debate. No longer were Conservatives looked at by others as being somehow away from this, or even locked out of the left's self-defined poverty debate, only able to take part often by lobbing verbal grenades. Instead, we had broken the door down and were able to enter with the strong sense that we had the right to be there on our terms, able to show that the safety net had for too many now become an entrapment, too often creating a culture of dependency which flowed down the generations. In government, the challenge has been to act on this work and to make changes, and in the last 3 years, the Conservative-led coalition has embarked on the largest set of reforms, I think, in modern times. These reforms start with the family, promoting the strong and enduring family relationships which are the bedrock of strong communities. For too long, the system has penalised couples staying together, with families on benefits perversely better off apart. Small wonder that in the bottom 2 deciles, stable family life has too often almost ceased to exist. We set about reversing the couple penalty, as the penalty that we refer to as penalising those who might choose to stay together as staying apart, acting to maintain family stability and enabling parents to give their children the best possible start in life. With the family first, then comes children's education. Here our reforms are about ensuring schools offer structure, routine, and a fair chance of success, no matter what that child's background is. Through the government pupil premium worth something like $1,500 per child this year, we're providing additional help specifically targeted to disadvantaged children, levelling the playing field and ensuring a positive platform for all children, therefore, to fulfil their potential. This investment in the early years stands to pay dividends further down the line, equipping individuals with the knowledge and aspiration and social capital they need to prosper. Yet for those already in difficulty, or whose lives do go off course, here too we are committed to offer individuals, I hope, a meaningful way out. No longer leaving people to struggle on the margins of society, but instead prioritising full recovery and reintegration into the community. Across government, we are pioneering new approaches to tackle disadvantage, be it addiction, crime, ill health, debt, or multiple difficulties which serve to compound one another. Through innovative and locally led initiatives, we are treating problems, bringing together delivery partners across the private, public and voluntary sectors and dealing with people, not processes. Take the pilot programs we've launched for our drug and alcohol addicts, where we're incentivising treatment, providing help to people who identify and address a whole range of social problems. Not just getting individuals clean, but also free from gangs and crime, off the streets, and improving their overall quality of life. Having a safe place to live, good overall health, and feelings of self-worth, all these are vital in supporting a full and lasting recovery. By paying providers only when they achieve these positive social outcomes, we pay for what works, both giving individuals the best chance at turning their lives around and ensuring that each and every pound of public money goes on life change rather than maintenance. And this is an important factor. The key Conservative mantra must be that every pound for life change. The last point is vital and the crux of what we're trying to achieve through our reforms. So let me explain why. For too long, our failure to make each pound count has cost us again and again, not only in terms of financial cost, higher taxes, inflated welfare bills, and lower productivity as people sit on benefits for longer and longer periods, but also the social cost of a fundamentally divided nation, one in which a section of society has been left behind. So even as governments across the Western world rightly take steps to stabilise their economies and get their public finances in order, it matters not just how much we spend, but how we spend it. Yes, we must bring expenditure back under control, vital. In the UK, one of the first steps we took on entering office was to announce welfare savings worth $18 billion annually by next year. Yet from day one, I've insisted that the right approach is one which doesn't just top slice, but focuses on transforming the life chances of those at the bottom in order to cut the cost of ongoing social failure. setting individuals on a journey from dependence to independence, whereby they can sustain the improvement in their lives beyond government money, restoring fiscal stability and restoring lives at the same time. We know that where people are able, work is always the best route for them to lift themselves out of poverty. That is why welfare support for those out of work should be seen as no different for work itself. Whilst you may not have a job, the state supports you, so you are in work to find work. Our reforms are about achieving this seamless process between being out of work and in work, introducing a number of elements so that being out of work resembles being in work. First and foremost is universal credit, fundamental reform of the welfare state, and possibly the most fundamental for a lifetime. About simplifying the system, rolling 6 out-of-work benefits into a single simple payment, withdrawn at a constant rate so that people always can see that it pays to work. It's paid monthly, online, and directly into claimants' bank accounts. The new benefit is modelled on the experience of those already in work, meaning that the majority who fall unemployed can focus straightforwardly on getting back into jobs rather than grappling with an archaic, complex, and useless benefit system. For those who do need extra help, improving budgeting support and access to the digital services means universal credit better prepares them for today's world of work. Take Universal Job Match, which uses automatic job searching now and matching to revolutionise how we support people to find and progress into work, getting their CV to work for them 24/7, even whilst they sleep. Together with the Work Programme, the largest payment by results employment programme the UK has seen, we're providing meaningful intensive support to get the hardest to help into work, and already the results are clear. Critical is that we de-risk the taxpayer in the process because we are paying, in the case of the Work Programme, only on the basis of success. More people now are in work than ever before, up almost 1 million since the government entered office, whilst the number without work is down some 450,000. The lower proportion of workless households than at any time under the last government. It was about 1 in 5 when we came in, and for the first time we've got it going down. And inactivity, that is the number of people who are unavailable for work for a variety of reasons, now close to its lowest level for 20 years, driven by falling numbers claiming the main out-of-work benefits, down over 400,000 since the last election. Universal credit and the Work Programme go hand in hand. Together they act as the pull into work, encouraging, incentivising and supporting individuals. Yet at the same time, the process of moving individuals from dependence to independence requires a push. Without it, you risk that money and support is given out, but without any expectation that individuals do anything in return, nor any mechanism to put pressure on those who could be doing more to help themselves. The importance of this interaction between pull and push cannot be underestimated. For just as those in work have obligations to their employer, so claimants have a responsibility to the taxpayer. In return for support, and where they are able, they must do their bit to find work. Our reforms make this contract unequivocal. We are requiring everybody now to sign up to a claimant commitment. It's a contract. As a condition of entitlement to benefit, it is deliberately set to mimic a contract of employment. Those who can work but are unemployed will be expected to engage with us, treating their search for work as a full-time job. If someone fails to do so without good reason, the commitment will also spell out in black and white the robust set of sanctions that they will face, losing their benefits for 3 months for the first offence, 6 months for the second, and 3 years for the third. This is what we in the UK call conditionality, setting clear requirements and making sure that if someone fails to meet their responsibilities, they face the consequences. In the welfare system, just as for those in work, no longer just out of work, but in work to find work. With the Conservative-led government leading the way on tightening up the conditionality regime in the UK, and as an observer of what Republicans here in the US are trying to achieve, my small suggestion is that this is one area you might want to look at again. In order to strengthen the statutory connection between benefit payments and work search levers within your own system. Improved support and strengthening conditionality, the pull and push I've spoken about, both vital if we are to ensure everyone is making progress from dependence to independence, the critical journey. So too the changes we are making to our pension system, which I won't explain in detail, but which are firmly aimed at instilling personal responsibility and self-sufficiency, here setting people on a path to a decent retirement. To that end, we are introducing an automatic enrolment into workplace pensions to make saving the norm. This is underpinned by the introduction of a new single-tier pension for which people contribute, which gives individuals a base income on which to build, planning and saving for their retirement, safe in the knowledge that it will pay to do so. So we have the twin mantras. It pays to work and it pays to save. Pro-social norms. A single logic running through the changes that we are making. Yet there is still one final piece to the puzzle. Fairness. A principle lacking for far too long in the welfare system. Let's take the housing benefits setup we inherited, under which it was actually possible for certain families to claim over $150,000 a year to cover incredibly high housing costs. With an overall housing bill that cost taxpayers half as much again in 2010 than it did a decade earlier. Equally, take the combination of out-of-work benefits adding up to more in state handouts than people could earn, in some cases, almost twice as much as the average weekly wage. This system isn't fair on hard-working taxpayers, paying out ever-increasing amounts to sustain others in lifestyles they could barely dream of affording themselves. Nor is it fair on benefit recipients themselves, who are then trapped in a system where it pays more to sit on benefits than it does to go to work. This is why we have limited the amount payable to cover housing costs, capped the amount a household can receive in benefits overall. Changes which mean families face the same choices about where they live and what they can afford, regardless of whether they are on benefits or in work. The reality is that fairness is important because people need to sign up to the idea of supporting people, but to do that they need to recognize that it is fair on them and fair on those they support. And what's more, because those claiming in-work credits are exempt from the benefit cap that we've introduced, we have ended the perverse incentive to remain on welfare as a way of life. In fact, since being notified that they potentially stood to be capped, more than 15,000 of those first going through, 15,000 people, actually moved into work. So too, through the dynamic changes we are making to sickness benefits, a big area, reforming a system that left too many people languishing on incapacity benefit indefinitely, 1 million of them for a decade or more, never being seen by anybody. And we have been reassessing all those claimants, staying with those who cannot work at the moment, but regularly checking on their condition, managing that process just as an employer would and should. Yet for 7 in 10 of those reassessed, it's now about preparing or looking for work. Whereas before nobody saw you, now we're starting that process back to work. No longer sat on benefits without a productive role to play, but instead receiving support that offers them a fair chance to realize their potential. In other words, reform that is not just about the benefit system, but about social renewal. Part of that conservative vision I described right at the start, of strong families, strong communities, upholding both personal freedom and personal responsibility. And this rather rapid explanation of our welfare reforms, missing out quite a lot, I suspect, I hope, however, nonetheless, it helps explain why I think Conservatives can and should regain the moral high ground on social change. To be a party of government, we must have a sense of balance in society, which in turn creates balance in the economy. So let me explain. As we modernise our work practices and create a more flexible and responsible economy, it's important that this is underpinned by social change. After all, we forget at our peril that the greatest resource we hold as nations is not the raw materials lying under the ground, but the human capital that populates our country. When I think of Great Britain, a country apparently a Russian recently described as small and unimportant, I think of Wilberforce and slavery, of Adam Smith and the free market, of habeas corpus and the right to own property. I think of Crick and Watson and the discovery of the double helix, of Fleming and Florey and penicillin, of Churchill and Thatcher and freedom. I could go on, as I'm sure, boring you to death. But it's not the size of your land. This is the point that I'm making. It is not the size of your land, but the size of your people you should be measured by. That is why we as Conservatives need to ensure that the welfare systems are aligned to the task of helping people succeed in a modern world and not trapping good people in dependency. The simple truth is that we cannot be prepared to see a growing number of our fellow citizens fall into an underclass of hopelessness and despair, for without them we will be unable to create that modern economy. A good Conservative should see immigration, for example, as a supply and demand issue. If we are prepared to leave so many behind, then it is obvious industry and others will then seek to fill that vacuum and fill its workforce elsewhere. Crime and health costs also start here as well. You can't tackle them separate from this single issue. But most important of all is the simple fact that you cannot ring-fence such communities and police your way to stability. As a friend once said, the inner city is not a place, but a state of mind. Yet to re-engage as political parties and become stalwart and relevant again, change is necessary, but not just any change. For example, there are those who say Conservatives should change by abandoning key beliefs that somehow sound unfashionable and out of date. Marriage, I think, is quite a good example of this as a philosophy of change. And I've had this on a number of occasions. Because, they argue, more children are born out of wedlock, we should stop speaking about the importance of marriage as people are choosing to abandon it and go with the flow of, say, cohabitation. After all, they argue, both relationships amount to the same thing. How wrong they are. Not because I want to lecture on it, but it's because the value of a strong and stable family lies at the heart of our Conservative values. And at the heart of that strong and stable family lies the most successful man-made institution of marriage. A Conservative value underpinned by the evidence. For the Centre Social Justice figures showed when we did this, it showed conclusively that the two relationships are quite different. More than 1 in 3 of those who cohabit with children have split up by their children's fifth birthday, whereas for married parents the breakup rate is fewer than 1 in 10. The one is much more unstable than the other, and we know that instability harms children's prospects as they grow up. It's not about lecturing, but about understanding. We also know that in a variety of polls, when young people are asked, below the age of 35, about their aspirations for the future, 3/4 place marriage at or near the top of their list. A good Conservative, seeing this, should approach this issue by asking themselves why the aspiration of young people so outstrips the achievement, and therefore what stands in the way of their aspiration. Not abandon your view, but find out why others who share it don't manage it. And it's not that people don't agree. It's that Conservatives too often make them feel uneasy about these things when they justify their belief by then attacking selected groups of people whose lifestyles they then think don't fit. After all, the public we know generally have a low regard for what they see as political cynicism that targets people simply to make a political point. Instead, they respond, I believe, to the politician who is sincere in his or her belief and clear about their commitment to make the change required in order to improve such outcomes. In short, less finger-wagging, more arm around the shoulder. Language matters as much as policy and belief. It's an area perhaps too often Conservatives do not think about. For example, too often Conservatives lecture everyone about the need for small government. It's kind of instinctive in us to speak immediately on this. Yet out there, to the unpolitically committed, most people think that when a Conservative or a Republican speaks about small government, it's actually a code for no government. No government frightens people, for most understand that they need some government to ensure fairness and the rule of law. Instead, we should speak of smaller government. And we can make that argument quite clearly, for I believe that most people recognize that big, large governments are inefficient and expensive for them as taxpayers. What we all really want, after all, is good, efficient government, which costs less, but governs wisely. Conservative purists would be hard-pushed to tell you what they actually mean by small, but we all know what we mean by smaller. In our hearts, we want a government that is on your side, but not on your back. That's what conservatives fundamentally believe in. So change is part of the conservative philosophy, but change against a value set that marks us as conservatives and keeps us in touch with modern society. Most of all, we need to remember that we want to improve the circumstances of people, not leave them trapped in dependency without hope. As Oscar Wilde once said, we're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. No, our fight is an age-old one to help improve the lot of the working poor, to give them the right to hope and the chance to aspire, to break that entrapment so beloved of the left. After all, who shall speak for them if we do not? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iain, for a very inspiring and thought-provoking speech this morning today. And I'd now like to open the floor, actually, to questions from the audience. But if I may take the liberty, Iain, of asking the first question. You've written a great deal about the importance of Margaret Thatcher in shaping your own thinking on welfare reform. Could you say a few words about the enduring importance of Thatcherite values for British conservatism today? And of course, there's a major debate taking place within the conservative movement in Britain on Thatcher's legacy, the debate between traditionalists and modernisers, for example. Could you address the enduring importance of Thatcher's ideals and principles for Britain in the 21st century?
I think the number of lessons, I touched on some of them in there. I think the first thing is we learned from Mrs. Thatcher that clarity in your belief is always ultimately a good thing because it allows people to be able to recognise your direction of travel. I mean, numbers of times I remember knocking on doors during campaigns when Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister, and people would come to the door and you would say who you were, a Conservative, and you were looking for them to vote for the Conservatives, and then you'd get into sometimes a kind of slightly heated debate about that woman. And that's how they'd be referred to, and there was an annoyance over something she'd said or something that had happened or the fact that she seemed so determined to do something which didn't seem the normal way and all the rest of it. And then we'd invariably, and this is not just that, it's really quite true, and a lot of others found it, you'd sort of end the conversation with, okay, so what will you vote? And then there'd be a pause and say, no, I'll vote Conservative. At least you know where you are with her, he said. And you shut the door. So having moaned a bit about what she was doing, they actually came back to the certainty of knowing exactly what that was. You didn't have to agree with everything, but you got a clear idea of where she would be in a few years' time, and everybody likes to have that sense of where you're going. So the first thing was clarity. The second thing, I think, in answer to this question, is governing, as I said earlier on, is about clarity, but also you have to make value decisions. So the idea too often we get in the debates as people screaming, you've got to do all these things, why aren't we doing these things? Is sometimes you need to make a balanced set of decisions about kind of the things you have to tackle as priorities. And for her, she made a clear idea of what her priorities were, getting the economy back under control, trying to break down those shackles of grey socialism that have been built up, tackle the trade unions, and deal with our reputation overseas, having lost it, but regaining that potency and capacity to influence events as well. So she had a set of priorities about her, and the rest she had to fit in around it. So understanding through clarity, but also prioritising. The last thing, of course, is that at no stage do you abandon who you are, even when the going is tough. People, as I said, far rather understand who you are and would even vote for you if you don't necessarily agree completely. But more importantly, what they don't like is people that appear to be shifting and changing simply for the sake of gaining a vote. People aren't stupid. They can smell that very quickly. So they would rather go with somebody who's clear, go with a set of policies that are clear, recognise not all can sometimes be delivered, but what she gave us was the enduring sense that to govern is to lead, and leading is vitally important in this process.
Excellent. Thank you, Ian. Couldn't agree more. The gentleman at the front there.
Yes, your reforms are a very impressive application of principles to everyday life. And the question I have is, how do you manage the problem of giving government money to private charity work, and somehow the charity work not becoming just another branch of the government? I mean, you know, he who pays a piper calls a
Yeah.
tune. So how do you manage that little problem?
Well, there are two things actually. You're absolutely right. The problem is that what happens is you want to go beyond the state, so you go to what we always called the third group, as it were, and then you find that you've taken them over because they rely so much on your money that either they're trying to influence your policy, which often happens, and now some charities set themselves up as perpetual lobbyists, as it were, to get policy changed. Otherwise, the smaller charities are scared stiff of what happens when a local authority gets disinterested in their project and cuts the money, and then they fold up. The way I think is the way we've started trying to do it. The first is to set up a process that tags money to organisations on the basis of achievement. So the work programme is a good example of that, where there are a lot of charities now involved in the work programme. The prime contractors for the work programme, getting people long-term unemployed back into work, you get paid only when you've got a 6-month attachment, that is to say someone's been in work, could be 2 jobs, but has done 6 months of work, then they get paid, and then they get paid at regular intervals after that. So the prime contractors tend to be private companies, although there are some charities involved, and they tend to hold the risk. But underneath the delivery of that is often broken out into small charities, and they don't take the risk, but they get paid for that. So they now have an expectation of achievement. So gone will be the days when they keep saying, we will save this much money. Now they have to demonstrate it, otherwise they don't get their money. So another way is to say, no, you put the onus on achievement. If you achieve, then we're very happy. We're not really interested too much in the fact you do it differently from somebody else. The key point is that you get it done. So that's one way, and that's a way of putting a lot of money, billions, into the charities if they get it right. The third way of doing it is to look at the other thing, which I haven't really talked about today at all, which we're changing at the moment, and this is the social investment idea, which is that you get the charities program evaluated. So if they've got an interesting idea, over here, for example, we took the family nurse partnerships dealing with dysfunctional families and difficult children. You evaluate what that works out to be. So for every pound you spend or dollar you spend, how many dollars would you get back by saving the government money? Now, this is hard saving, realizable in 5 years. So you work that out by evaluating that program and the change that it brings. Using that, you then can open the door to create bonds now. So you can bring private or philanthropic money in to set up a bond which guarantees a sum of money to an organization like that for a period of time. And that return is underwritten by government, maybe with a tax incentive relief on the way in, and then some payment by results in there, which then guarantees that money, which guarantees that against government whimsicality and change, but has to be on delivery. So this social bond stuff, I think, will be a huge breakthrough in the next 10 years because it could revolutionize the way we pay for programs on both sides of the Atlantic for one very good reason, that if you do this, it ensures that you stay with the program. So in other words, if the program is adjudicated as working, then everything in that has to be on the program. If you divert from it, you cut the money. So now you have, for the first time, real discipline in program delivery, which in the past is often not the case. And the second thing is you know where your pound is going. You know what to expect at the end of it. And now you bring new money in from outside that wouldn't necessarily be government money. And I think there's a final thing which is really brilliant about this, which also brings wealthier organizations and people back in contact with difficult areas. Because if you invest in a bond like this, as you would if you invested in anything, you're going to take a direct interest. So they can get a bit of social capital as much as you get financial capital.
Right. Gentleman here, please do identify yourself and any institutional affiliation.
It's nice to talk to a Brit again. My name is Lukat Malik. I'm currently a senior fellow at SAIS, Johns Hopkins, also professor at National Defence University in Islamabad. Born and brought up in Yorkshire.
I won't hold that against you.
But it's grim up north, I admit.
Yeah.
I've had a varied life. Just a small comment, and I'm going to go into a serious question here. I find that there is nothing I disagree with you on what you've said here right now. Because I've experienced that part of life where I had a chance given to me through the social welfare system, where without which I would not have been a national advisor on counter-terrorism to Pakistan, or not been here. However, I find also then, and this is the question is, that there's a general perception that the Conservative Party has failed one of the most conservative communities in Britain, minority communities, which I was brought up in an ultra-conservative environment. I'm quite liberal compared to them, but generally conservative. Yeah. And that consistency you fail to get a hold of is more psychological than actually value-based. It's a perceptional issue that they think that you're not on their side by the way they perceive you. And that is a point that has been taken by a lot of people. A colleague of yours was a friend of mine, the first Muslim female to be a cabinet member. We were at the same college.
Saida.
Yeah, I was a student union president and she was secretary.
Very good.
But that's not the point. The point is there are a few people that are moving ahead. But the town I grew up in is now probably the most segregated environment, urban environment there is in Britain. That needs to be dealt with.
I completely agree with you. I think the challenge you make is one for, I would suspect, probably on both sides of the Atlantic for Conservatives in terms of perception. I mean, the truth is, if you tick off all the things that we share as communities, you'd find that actually for many communities in the UK, belief in strong families, strong responsibilities, work ethic, these things are very strong and are still being passed from generation to generation. They've broken down actually in the conditions of previous existing British community, often with great problems. So it's establishing that those values that I was speaking about today matter to who you are. And I think this is the bit that really we face challenges to ensure that everybody who lives and works in the UK and is a citizen in the UK has a sense that they have a right to belong there. If you're a citizen, you have the right to belong there, and your politics should be about the politics of what makes your country better. And these things that I'm advancing today, I think, are those. You're right that it's a difficult thing to break through because there is still that resistance to the sense that somehow they might believe that Conservatives don't necessarily believe they should be there, but that's not the case now. But getting that message across is really clear. So language, I spoke about language in here. Language is really, really important. It's got to be very inclusive language, and I don't mean that in a kind of vague leftist way. They use inclusion as though, it's just every other word. The truth is inclusion is about saying that these things, these values that matter are values that matter to everybody, and we all benefit from them. There was a very good poster many years ago Conservatives produced about the different perceptions, and it was about something out of the Caribbean, and the poster said, Labour says he's black, we say he's British. And that's exactly the point that I want to make, is that it doesn't really matter what your ethnic background is or how you perceive your community from home. The key thing is, what are your prospects, and can you put something back into your country? And we need to kind of make certain of that. And Said is very much on that. So I think that's beginning to break down, by the way. It's slow, but I think it's beginning to break down. It is beginning to break down, but it is a big challenge to us, to keep talking about people's right to remain.
Right, actually, we have time just for two last questions. So, this gentleman here and gentleman over there.
Hi, I'm Andrew Evans with the Washington Free Beacon here. My question is about local initiatives and local entrepreneurship as a means to, this isn't working very well, as a means to sort of attack social problems like poverty and
Yes.
the breakdown of marriage. How do you, as a minister, and how does your government encourage local entrepreneurship without sort of co-opting it? This is similar in a way to the gentleman's question over here, but how do you encourage it while keeping it local, while encouraging the local entrepreneurship, the initiative on the local level?
Well, much of what I've answered previously is quite important. I think the payment by results process will hugely invigorate organisations like this because it gets the political control out of the system. Because we have a simple contract, you succeed, we pay you. That's it. I can't have a view about what you do, you succeed, I pay you. The second bit was the point about social investment. I think that is just at the early stages, but I think the future for voluntary and charity groups lies in social investment. Because if they can demonstrate, and the important thing is, you know, lots of charities do lots of good work, but some make claims for things that don't really work. So the key question, I've set up an organisation under actually a Labour MP who's an old friend of mine, to adjudicate and to look at and evaluate what works and what doesn't work, and then advise councils, because most of this is done at local level, not at national level. You know, how would they, for example, tackle school indiscipline or whatever? Are there programmes to stop young girls, you know, getting pregnant whilst at school? You know, there are good programmes. Canada's got some good stuff. So can you evaluate what the dollar return or pound return is, and then set up a bond around that? That's the key. So the future on the social bond, I think, is almost limitless. Ronald Cohen, who set up big investment markets in the UK 20 years ago, 25 years ago, he's now looking at this at the moment, and he thinks this is a huge marketplace that can be created, but for social good. And it's applying a conservative principle to a social problem. So we are saying we can reach out and get more money from outside, but we won't do it by just asking for more tax. What we're going to do is get you to bind yourself to this whole idea and do what you would do in running a business, which is invest in something that gives you a return, but also delivers a massive social benefit. So now a company or a philanthropic organisation could actually say to themselves, and publicly, well, they're proud of themselves because what they've done is help this organisation in this part of a difficult area get more kids back into work, or they've helped with family breakdown and drug addiction or something. And now that's a badge of honour for them. And it's not as though they chuck their money away on some thing that they can write up and say, I feel good because I did something. No, I feel good because I achieved something, and that's the difference. It's not inputs, but it's outcomes that we're moving to, and it's outcomes that charities who really work will benefit from, and that's what the social bond is about.
Salim Firth from the Heritage Foundation here. I really appreciate how much you've talked about incentives and the design and really the thought that's gone into designing welfare reforms. I was curious if you might have a few just very practical, you know, dirt under the fingernails lessons from implementation, the things that you've encountered in the last couple of years.
Where do you start? These things are all difficult to change because you deal, first of all, with the fact that you have to continue to help support people who are already in difficulty. So as you change, you've got to be sensitive to the fact that that change has to be done in a way that allows you to make the change while still supporting them. We have, you know, legacy benefit systems. I'm sure they have them over here as well, and they're complicated and often bodged together because, you know, politicians like me come up with a brilliant idea. We must change it tomorrow. So a bunch of people beaver away, they make a change, patch some change into some existing system, now making it so complicated that nobody quite knows what actually lies within the system. So is scared stiff of opening up the system again. So, you know, changing the whole system is the way to go, and we are doing that at the moment with big changes with through the work programme, but also change with disability benefit and IT systems. We know everyone says, they always have problems with IT systems. Yeah, but the world has problems with IT systems. You develop them, they're not static entities. They are, however, massive deliverers of good benefit and simplification. So that is delivery in that area is always difficult, but, you know, as long as you stay on it, focused, make key decisions and change early, you'll get these things through and they will benefit. But it's the blend of trying to get the change while still continuing to meet your obligations, which is probably the biggest challenge of all, particularly when you're dealing with a system that deals with millions of people every day, payments every day that go out like that. And if people fail to get payments within a very short order of time, for some of them, they're in real difficulty. So keeping that system running alone is a tough exercise. But yeah, it's tough. Don't make any bones about that.
Great. Thank you very much, Iain, for a tremendous speech today, and we're very grateful that you came to see us today. We hope that you will be back here soon, and we wish you every success with your tremendous welfare reform efforts across the Atlantic. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us here today. I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible. Rejoin us for future events here at the Heritage Foundation and Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom. Thank you very much.